Well, good morning, everyone. We'll get the hearing underway for this day 3 of the hearing of submissions on the Creswell, New Zealand resource consent applications for their water bottling plant. For those of you who haven't been here in preceding days, my name is Rob van Voorthausen. I'm an Independent Hearings Commissioner based in Napier, and I'm joined by
Commissioner Coffin.
All right, just before we turn to the submitters who are scheduled for today, do the reporting officers have anything to bring to our attention at this stage? No. Does the applicant have anything to bring to our attention at this stage?
That's been reported and that's been provided to Ms Nicholas, but we'll hear more about that.
Okay, thank you very much for that. All right, so the submitters, the first submitter on my list for today is Mr. Ian Gray.
Correct.
Yep, good morning and welcome.
Morning.
To you and all the other submitters, we've read the actual submissions that you've lodged, and if you've lodged additional evidence, as some of you have, we've read that as well. So you do not need to read out to us the original submissions or any evidence that you've lodged because we've already read that. But you're very welcome to speak to your submissions or evidence and to highlight your key points for us. And we're keen to make sure that we fully understand your concerns and what you're asking us to consider. So with that introduction, over to you, Mr. Gray.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to speak today. I'm a relatively new resident, recently moved in, come from Tauranga. I'd like to talk about 4 points: why we live rural, the business expansion, the big picture, and conditions. So why we live rural? We live rural because of the peace and the quiet. We came to 46 Johnson Road to be near our grandchildren, 3 grandchildren. It's a no-exit road, so there's low traffic. It's safe for children to play, safe for people to cycle, safe for people to walk their dogs. My wife's into horse riding, so we moved here to have horses, and I'm interested in horticulture. Riding horses needs to be a safe place. Currently, it's nice verges to ride horses. There's no traffic, so there's no risk of anybody getting spooked by trucks or cars. And we read the Whakatane District Council Section 7 objectives for rural, 1, 2 and 3, before we moved, and they seem to back up the fact that it would be a great place to come and live and spend our retirement. Of course, we were not really aware that this was going to be considered. And to be honest, the major challenge that we have with the business expansion is the scale. The scale is not really an expansion. It's a completely new operation. I'm a business owner, so I know from a business perspective, people are always interested in growing their business. But you've got to balance that against the community benefits. And I think this tips the scale in completely the wrong direction, particularly around the traffic and the movement of trucks. We're talking about 184 truck movements on a no-exit road over 10 hours. So when you've got grandchildren and you've got your wife and you've got other friends walking down that road, there's major safety concerns. And it's not just cars who use that road. There was a submission I read recently saying that it's a low volume of traffic. It's not cars that just use that road, it's people, it's horse riders. You've got to consider other road users, not just cars. The other thing to comment is, I'm in the software business. I know what software can do for a business. They're talking about additional jobs in a manufacturing plant. The likelihood in a few years' time, there'll be no additional jobs. It'll all be automated. It'll all be robotic. Artificial intelligence is coming, I know, because I'm building it. Manufacturing will not be a people-based role, it will be all automated. The other thing is the pollution. They're talking about 24/7. That means consistent light pollution. If you go rural, you want to see the night sky, you want to see the Milky Way, you don't want to be blinded by light pollution. You also don't want noise, and you certainly don't want trucks going up and down the lane with truck fumes. The visual size of the plant is going to be 12 metres, or proposed to be 12 metres. That's way above the shelter belt tree limit. And also, the building of the plant 30 months is going to cause massive amounts of toxic dust, which is going to potentially affect any horticultural activities around the area. And I can't believe that we're considering something that's going to produce X many millions or more than millions of plastic bottles we're contributing to the world pollution of plastic. Not to mention the risk potential of the aquifer and the building near the stock bank, which is liable to flooding. And if you're living where we're living, then that is a major concern. From a big picture perspective, we need to manage water much more carefully. We've seen massive climate events and changes. And in fact, on the MPI website, it calls for adaptation process to better conserve water, because we're going to have river flow decline, more droughts and extreme floods. Rain-fed groundwater is going to be reduced, and yet we're talking about taking millions of litres out of the Otakiri aquifer. The other big picture is, from a New Zealand perspective, horticulture is where it's going to be at. Plant-based value chain is where it's going to be at. We need to get jobs there, not in water bottling plants. Hort is the future for the region. Job creation should be in the hort sector, not in water bottling plants. Finally, if such an application were approved, we would want some conditions. We don't think the scale of the expansion needs to be that big. We need to limit to a sensible level. I'm sure that some of the residents would probably cope with double, but certainly not 10 times. That will reduce truck movements, it will reduce pollution. We do not want a 24/7 operation in a rural environment, business hours only. We want improved safety for walkers, cyclists, and particularly children, and their activities in the local area. And we would want continuous publicly monitored pollution and water quality levels. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. See if we have questions for you.
Good morning. You mentioned this morning, it's also in your submission, that you've moved recently. How recently exactly you've moved to Johnson Road?
About 4 weeks. We bought the house towards the end of last year, after the submission to the Whakatane District Council was set aside.
Oh, okay.
So, and we read the Whakatane District Council Section 7, and we thought, yep, that if they're true to their word, this will not happen. Otherwise, council documents are not worth the paper they're printed on.
Okay. Much of your submission, you talk about the rural character of the area, and you've mentioned that this morning. And I picked out of your submission, you raise things like calm, peaceful, untroubled, tranquil, low traffic, and you've mentioned a number of other things. And just looking at and you've used the particular provision of the plan in regards to Objective Rural 2 to maintain where appropriate enhance rural character. And I can't help thinking that we've had a number of the residents come and talk about the rural character, and I couldn't help thinking they're talking about a rural lifestyle character. In my mind, is something slightly different. But I just wondered if there were any other things that you saw were particularly.
So it's rural character is about the whole environment. You know, you move rural to get away from any kind of industrial activity. You don't move rural to then go next to an industrial park. You go because you want to hear the birds sing in the trees, you want to go for walks, you want to see the night sky, you want to be surrounded by the environment. You don't want to be near human activity of an industrial scale at all possible.
Okay.
It's a lifestyle. It's a rural lifestyle.
So you think the rural lifestyle in the rural zone is different to a rural zone which has industrial activities in it, like trucks moving around, tractors, vehicles, equipment?
It's a complete, I mean, what you're talking about here is an industrial scale plant moving bottles on containers up and down that road, 184 truck movements. That is not why you move to rural. You can cope with tractors moving, farmers moving, but they're not going to move 184 times in 10 hours. They're not going to move a truck every 3 minutes. If you've got a horse or a child riding a bike down that lane, there's potentially multiple truck movements that they're risk at.
Now, in your submission, you've said, this is towards the end of the submission now, which page are we on? I think it's page 8 of your submission, is that if the consent was granted, here are some conditions that you've listed, and those are listed 1 to 8, and I wonder if it was okay if we could just go through those, if that's okay. Certainly, perhaps this is something we've said each day, you know, that we are asking about the conditions, proposed conditions of consent during the hearing, but that no way means that we've made up our minds that we're going to grant the consent. Certainly we want to, while we've got everybody in the room, we're able to ask these questions, so I just want to make that clear to you.
It's all good.
So I just want to clarify these ones. So the first one is just the facility expansion is approved for only an increase in size, no more than double the current level of operation. So we did a site visit the other day, and it sounds like all the residents knew we were there. So we've seen.
I was probably at work, so I didn't know you were there.
Yeah. So as we understand it, there's the sheds and the operation itself. There's currently 2 bores on the site. So you're saying, in terms of double, you mean double of what we currently see on the site?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, there's a very limited amount of movement of traffic as well. It's more to do with the volume that's going out of there, in and out of there.
Just in number 2, we understand, well, the applicant has informed us that there is an agreement, I think, with Kiwi Rail in terms of the upgrade of the crossing with the railway. So just mentioning that in terms of number 2. Number 3, pathways. We understand the current proposal is to have a footpath on the left-hand side of the road as you're going up the road towards the plant. Were you aware of that?
It doesn't really matter whether there's a footpath there or not. I mean, it's important. If the scale's less, that's great. But if you're talking about that much traffic going up and down, and you're talking about children riding their bikes, even if you've got a pedestrian footpath or not, it's still a risk. Especially when you've got horses.
Number 4 is the visibility of the plant and the containers. Not above the 10-metre mark in line with the current shelter belt tree heights. I just want to be clear about what you're
So my understanding is that you can't build anything above the current limit for shelter belts. And my understanding is that the proposal is that it's going to be way above that. So there's no way that that's going to be invisible to the human eye. So you're going to be looking at a shed, basically. That's not enhancing the rural character, in my opinion.
So you've said in terms of potential conditions, what was the condition you were looking for that might be addressed that? Because you've addressed what the issue is.
A lot of this is, yes, there's a lot of talk about, water going abroad and making lots of money out of water and all that kind of stuff. And I agree, that's wrong. But the key thing for me is the scale of the expansion or the scale of the new site is not in keeping with Whakatane District Council Section 7, and it's positively dangerous to the people in the community who live there.
You've mentioned already this morning around business hours, and I think that's what you're meaning, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. 5 days a week, so I'm assuming that's Monday to Friday.
Yep. Every other business works business hours,
Saturday.
mostly.
I'm not sure. I wouldn't want to presume what business hours are these days. I know what my business hours are. But, construction of the plant to be in line with operations, that's in a similar vein. So that's the construction period you're talking about. I assume that's your Monday to Friday. Regular community reporting on the construction progress. So when you say that's to be published, are you meaning like that's something that might be a letter drop to the community, or a meeting form, or in the local paper?
Yeah, or online, regular alerts, regular notifications, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Because, what's happening at different parts of the country, yes, they've given consent to do some kind of drilling, and all of a sudden you find out they're drilling into the actual public water supply. Down south, Canterbury is a classic example. So nobody knew about that. So how come? Why wasn't there any reporting? Why was there any monitoring? It's a concern.
And continuous noise level monitoring and reporting. So where were you thinking that if there was monitoring, where that might occur?
Down on the roadside.
Down the roadside. So that's outside the plant on the roadside?
Or all the way along. Because, when trucks move, they accelerate and they brake, and air brakes come on, and that causes noise. You don't expect lots and lots of truck noise when you're in a rural environment.
And like the number 7, the regular community monitoring, you'd like that publicly available in a similar vein? On
a regular basis. It's a bit like project management, regular monthly report, weekly report, what's happening.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. That was all my questions, Mr. Chair.
Just one further question. I think I know the answer to it, Mr. Gray, but In your submission, you don't mention a house on the property, and the little aerial photograph I have doesn't show a house, but I take it there is a house on your property?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
It's been there for a long time.
Yeah, yeah. I just wanted to make sure that.
Yeah, yeah. The title is 46D, but the postage is 46G.
Pardon?
The title is 46D, Johnson
Yeah.
Road, but the post address is 46G.
Yeah.
And it's
Oh,
one of
okay.
One of the first houses.
Yeah,
that
yeah,
was
there's
there.
definitely a house on my little
Yeah.
aerial that says 46G, 406G, 46G. Okay, so that's your house there. All right, that's all. No further questions from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See if no one raises it. All right, the next submitter on my list is Forest and Bird, Linda Koning. Now, I think you heard my introduction that we've read the material that's been pre-circulated. Thank you for taking the time to do that. It's always helpful when the evidence is pre-circulated so we can read it in advance and think about it. That's good, thank you very much. Are there any key points you wish to highlight or anything you wish to speak to in terms of that material?
Yes, kia ora, good morning, Mr Chairman. Yes, I would like to elaborate on a number of aspects. The first of which is just under paragraph 3. The Society doesn't actually support the application. It has a number of concerns which we've explored in our submission, and I'll go on to talk about those. Now, in the statement that I provided the other day, there's quite a bit of material about the National Policy Statement and the Environment Court case Sustainable Matata, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yep.
I'd just like to emphasise in the context of this consent, the NPS policy A4, where you must have regard to avoiding contamination that will have an adverse effect on the life-supporting capacity of fresh water. The Society's main concern is the effect on Howlett's Drain and the waterway downstream of that. And so the nub of the Society's submission to you today is really that the adverse effects of the discharge will only be addressed if that discharge is treated through a wetland or other land-based treatment. I'd just like to emphasise paragraph 377 of the Environment Court's decision, which says adding to an existing background level, albeit degraded, will not achieve maintenance. The whole tenor and the single message that comes from all the planning documents, and the court emphasises and comes to the same conclusion, is that maintenance and improvement of water quality is the outcome that is sought in these situations. I haven't actually presented to you any analysis of the planning documents which the two planners have referred to, because that was done very thoroughly by the Environment Court in Sustainable Matata, and I saw no purpose in repeating that analysis. So, at the risk of repeating myself, I want to emphasise that the discharges coming from this consent should not be allowed under the NPS Freshwater Policy A4, as it's adding to existing degradation, notwithstanding that existing water quality exceeds the guidelines. Now, when discharge limits are set under the NPS, which is yet to happen, and in my opinion, it could be another 10 or more years before that happens. But it's inevitable that Howlett's Drain will be over-allocated, in inverted commas, as to nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus. So why would you add to that load now? I'm involved in a number of regional water forums, and one of the issues that's coming out of that is clearly how is the over-allocation going to be managed? And current consent holders are concerned that new consents are adding additional contamination, and that will put more pressure on their current consents, and there may be some derogation from current consents. The other aspect to go along with the maintain and improve concept is avoiding cumulative effects. Now, alum dosing was referred to in the AEE, and we're aware that alum dosing to treat phosphorus can cause toxicity to fish if it's not very carefully managed. I didn't see any response or further information about this either in the AEE or the Section 42A report or any of the evidence. So I just draw your attention to that aspect. The Society is opposed to actually adding more chemicals to treat the chemical discharge. It just seems to be a contradiction. The information on Hallett's drain is well known. I just draw your attention to the fact that there are threatened native species present and the potential for biological harm if there is further degradation. The key issue that we have with this consent is it's an approach of discharge, monitor, and then do something if what the monitoring shows is not acceptable. But we ask the question, what actions are likely if the monitoring shows unacceptable effects? What can practically be done to halt these adverse effects, apart from ceasing the discharge, which would, as we understand it, frustrate the consent? So really, it seems it's quite a perverse outcome, because what is proposed is taking water from the ground to dilute the discharge from the process. In our view, this is not efficient or sustainable use. We have given considerable thought to the whole issue of mitigation, and ideally, mitigation for this situation would be remediation of large parts of Hallett's drain through riparian planting to create shading to reduce the high temperatures, and the planting of dense native grasses on the banks, which both for wildlife and to trap sediment and create some kind of filtering. The difficulty in this particular situation is most of Hallett's drain runs through private land that's not owned by the applicant, and therefore that is not an easily applied solution. But in our consideration of this issue, we consulted a couple of different ecologists, and the clear answer that we were given was the only way to really effectively manage this discharge, if the consent is granted, is to put it through a wetland infiltration type of system. You would have you would excavate to at least a metre, you would densely plant it with raupo or other wetland species. I'm sure the applicant's stormwater engineer could do the calculation to work out what area was required to have sufficient residence time for that method to be effective. And for a perfect outcome is that what came out of that wetland would then be piped through one of the other wetlands on the plains. So the other concern we had was this issue of efficient allocation. The application includes a 10% contingency take, and so the application is 5,000 cubic metres a day. That's 500 cubic metres a day. There's 450 cubic metres a day is going to come out through the waste stream. So you've got 1,000 cubic metres a day that's actually not going to be bottled, sold or used for any positive practical purpose, and that takes that water out of the pool that could be allocated to some other use, and we've heard from the previous submitter about horticulture being the growth industry in this area, which it is, clearly. So really, the Society seeks that this be declined unless the phosphorus discharge can be adequately treated without adding further chemicals. In terms of conditions, the Society is extremely opposed to conditions that set conditions later on after the consent's been granted. It's a very poor way of managing resource allocation and effects. We need to know what the effects are going to be and how they can be managed. If there can be conditions put in that if monitoring after a certain level or a certain period of time shows that there are no further adverse effects that need to be managed, then the amount of monitoring can be reduced. But the Society totally supports having the trigger levels that Mr. Scholes has recommended actually in the consent. I was also quite concerned to notice that in condition 8.7, it's got a list of all those water quality discharge parameters that are in the Act, but the really important one, any significant adverse effects on aquatic life, was not included. I don't know whether that was just an oversight, but that's certainly something that should be right in the forefront. Another condition that should have been in there, and I don't know why it isn't, because it's a condition of all sorts of rules in the Natural Resources Plan, is that construction of the stormwater outfall should not occur during the whitebait migration season. So to conclude, I've spoken to a lot of people, both inside and outside Forest and Bird, about this application. Without exception, all have been shocked to learn that the water in the bottle is not direct from the aquifer, but has been processed. And to add insult to injury, the waste from this processing is to be put into a nearby waterway, despite the phosphorus levels in the discharge being 10 times above the ANZAC guidelines. Adding contamination to a degraded water body is contrary to Section 5 and 30 of the Act and to the NPS freshwater management. 20% of the water sought will not be bottled, it will either be waste stream or just in case. And so unless the discharge can be treated without further chemicals to an acceptable level, the consent should be declined and no more than 4,500 cubic metres should be granted. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, I just had a couple of questions. First one is, you mentioned you'd consulted a couple of ecologists, and so I just wanted to know if those ecologists you mentioned had been to the site.
No, they haven't, but one of them is familiar with the site and is familiar with the Bay of Plenty area. The other one works for Forest and Bird and gave me advice about mitigation and offsetting and the aspect of adding to existing degradation in a water body.
And so did that include the advice on potentially using a wetland?
Yes.
Okay. Have you been to the site, to the property?
Yes. I haven't been on the property, but I'm
Been to the roadside?
I'm familiar with it.
Okay. This is perhaps a question for the applicant, because you talked about the waste stream of, in your submission, 450 cubic metres. And then you mentioned 10% of waste stream, and then you just mentioned 20% potentially waste stream. So for the
Oh.
applicant, just to clarify,
Yes,
what is
sorry
waste
if I
stream?
didn't
That
make
would be
that clear.
helpful.
The waste stream as in the application is for approximately 450 cubic metres a day, but I've added in the contingency of, they've got a 10% contingency they have stated in the
Oh, so
application.
you've added those together.
Yeah.
Okay. Perhaps we'll get some clarification from the applicant. Thank you.
In terms of the approach that you're advocating that we take, based largely on sustainable matata, I guess the problem with that, and the applicants pointed that out to us, that if we were to take that approach that's come out of that one division of the court, it would mean that there could be no new discharges of contaminants to possibly any water body in New Zealand, because arguably most water bodies in New Zealand are degraded to some extent. And so a pedantic application of that case would mean no new discharges to water bodies anywhere in the country. Do you have a comment on that?
Yes, I think that's taking it a bit far. One thing I didn't mention is that I consider that this application is very similar in nature to the one that the court was looking at, and I don't interpret that as being, because the court went through all the Tarawera Catchment Management Plan and the Regional Water and Land Plan, and looked at the whole thing in the round. I mean, what's lacking here is that the discharge is the nature of the discharge and what the applicant proposes to do about it. The applicant is just saying, well, we're just going to put it into that waterway because it's degraded, and we're not going to do anything about trying to remedy that degradation or mitigate our discharge by giving it some other treatment, which may actually mean that it has no effect, the discharge, if it's properly treated. So, I mean, that's up to the applicant, and we realise that's an issue for the applicant because the applicant would actually have to find some land to put that on, or else have a smaller operation to be able to include it on the site that they already own. But that, I guess what we're trying to emphasise here is that business as usual is no longer the operating situation now, post the National Policy Statement. People are on notice, they have to change the way they do things.
Could I ask a supplementary question?
Okay, that didn't really answer my question, but I'll
Oh.
leave it there.
I've got a supplementary question to that. You say this is a similar case to Matata case, and I'm wondering specifically, what do you mean by it's a similar case?
It's a similar case in terms of it's a discharge of a nutrient into a waterway on the Rangataiki Plains, where water quality is poor across most of the waterways, and where a lot of the original water bodies have been heavily modified by drainage, they've been straightened and so on. I don't actually see a distinguishing factor apart from the discharge in sustainable matata was going to be into the old Rangataiki Channel, and this is into supposedly a drain. And one day, hopefully, we will stop calling these water bodies drains. But that's what we've got here on the table.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to take you back to your actual submission as opposed to the evidence, because as you're aware, the evidence can't expand the scope of the original submission. And I want to ask you about the relief that you've sought and go through them one by one. So, decision sought, Romans 1, require an ecological survey of the drain. Is that still an outstanding concern? Have you read the
I have
Boffin
been,
School
yeah,
report?
I've ticked and crossed some of these. Maybe I'll just
We'll just go through them one by one, shall we? So is number one still a concern?
Yes, because as I understand it, the applicant wants to commence the consent before the 12 months of baseline monitoring. And the triggers that Mr Scholes recommended to be included in the consent would be helpful from that point of view, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And also the onward monitoring, I think the applicant only wants to carry on monitoring for 1 year, and Mr Scholes was saying for at least 3 years.
And Romans 2, are you still unclear?
That's not an issue.
That's okay.
Number 3 is not an issue.
Okay.
Number 4 is still an issue. We really do question whether contingency is efficient allocation.
So that's the 10% margin that's been asked for. Yeah.
Now, number 5, retention of the waste stream. I'm not 100% sure whether that is sufficient or not, and I have to rely on the panel to satisfy themselves. We did add in our hearing statement that the size of the tank for the cleaning in place process needs to be sufficient, including contingencies.
So when you say waste stream, do you mean the clean in place water?
Yes, that's what I'm referring to there, because
And in particular, the intent to capture the nitrate part of that?
yes, so all of those added chemicals need to be stored, and also because it wasn't until I read the evidence from Mr. Sorry, I've forgotten his name, but the stormwater expert, Mr. Fullerton, I think his name is.
Yep.
That it became clear the exact nature of the waste stream in terms of the different components and the concentrations thereof. I didn't fully understand that from the AEE.
Yep.
So it could be that if these concentrations are what they say they are, then, and I think, and the way I understand it, they're going to, over a period of 5 days, this will be discharged and diluted so that it's at a certain level. I do have a concern as to whether there is sufficient storage for all of that wastewater so that it won't have to be discharged until it has been sufficiently diluted and the pH raised to a more acceptable level. There was reference, and so going on to number 6, Mr. Chairman, on that.
No, just a minute. So does Forest and Bird have any concerns about the stormwater treatment and disposal system?
I don't think we raised that in our submission.
I'm really just trying to clarify what you mean by waste.
I'm talking about the water that's been through the membrane where some of the minerals have been
Yep.
concentrated, plus the chemicals and the wash water from the cleaning in place process.
Okay. So, yep. Number 6, the chemical management plan. What's that?
Well, again, it wasn't that clear from the AEE exactly what was being proposed, but so that's why we put that into the submission, because there was some suggestions that there might be chemicals used, and we thought it was necessary, if that was going to be the case, that be included in the conditions and not something else that was going to be sorted out later.
Yep. And in terms of the limits, you've referred already to what Mr. Scholes has recommended to us, so I take it Forest and Bird would be happy with Mr. Scholes' recommended trigger level?
Yes, we don't have any reason to question them.
And I guess with the proviso, and I'm putting words in your mouth now, that they're imposed now rather than later.
Yes.
Okay. Alum dosing, applicant can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think alum dosing's part of the application currently, is it? There's no proposal for alum dosing.
Okay, it was mentioned in the AEA.
Yeah, it
that's-
was, but I
yeah.
don't, it's been clarified they don't intend to
Okay,
do
thank
that.
you. 8 is not an issue,
Okay,
and 9, I believe Mr. Scholes was requesting monthly monitoring.
yeah, so when you say reporting, did you mean monitoring?
I meant both actually, because I think in the application they were only going to report annually. And on what had been monitored monthly, but they were only going to report annually, and that to me is not effective, because if there's a problem that's brought up by the monitoring, you need to take some action, and if you don't know for 12 months, it's a waste of time.
All right, thank you very much for that. Any further questions? No further questions. That's been helpful, thank you.
Thank you.
The next submitter on my list is Mike Vanderboom. Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, I'm not sure who was here and who wasn't at the start. Were you here at the start when I said we'd read?
Yeah. I won't be reading off the.
Yeah, that's
my
great,
proposal.
thank you. But yeah, very welcome to summarise your key concerns for us.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I think that I've made 2 submissions. One was to the District Park Council side of things, and one to the Regional
Yep.
Council side of things. You've got them both. I think I'll just go over the main points.
Yep.
You will be hearing from more neighbours today, and I am a neighbour. My property is on the southern side of the bottling plant.
Yep.
410 Hallett Road.
Yep.
That's right.
Yep. So we're at 410 Hallett Road, and a lot of the concerns that our neighbours have brought up relate to the traffic, and I agree with that, but we're not so heavily impacted by the traffic because the trucks don't go down our road, but we do see the trucks and hear the trucks on Johnson Road. So that is an issue for us, but more concern to us immediately is the container area, which is right on our boundary. Now that container area, if I'm correct, will be operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that's not exactly why we bought our lifestyle property. It's obviously going to have an impact on us, and there are several neighbours next to us too, who will also be affected, and across the river on Moody Road. I'd like to talk about the amenity values. I've made those points, rural amenity values. And I understand that in a previous submission, one of the applicants made the point that the water bottling plant was there first, and we bought the property knowing that the water bottling plant was there and that we should just put up with it. Well, that's a load of crap. Really is. That bottling plant consent was given, I think it was 91, was it? That was for a very, very small sized plant. And if you came to our property, you would barely notice that bottling plant is existing. But what we've got here is a plant. The scale of the plant is, I think it's wrong that we're looking at an extension of an existing water bottling plant. It should be a new activity given the scale of the operation. it's certainly going to impact our lives. So when we bought our property, we went along and we didn't notice that there was a water bottling plant. But if we went, say, 3 years' time and we noticed, if we were looking at buying the property, we would certainly notice the amount of trucks and the noise coming from next door and the light pollution. So I think that to say that that we should put up with it because there's already a water bottling plant there is a nonsense. I guess the analogy that we could use is that, say we bought a house next to a B&B, and occasionally there were guests, maybe every night or every second night, and then that B&B decided to expand into a 60-room hotel. I think that's the sort of comparison we've got here. This is an industrial-sized plant. So that's our kind of, as a neighbours, that's our major concern. I think that when we talk about, also someone mentioned that the economic benefit outweighs the effect on us as a community, and I think that's a load of rubbish as well. I saw one report saying that the economic benefits would be in the region of 7 to 8 million for the district. I struggle with that in some ways, and that I think that that's not enough to outweigh the lifestyle of 30 people, 30 families in our area. I just want to bring up a point that was raised just in the previous, by a previous neighbour about the traffic and the footpath. And Commissioner Coffin, you mentioned, you asked a question about whether the footpath would mitigate the truck traffic, and I think that it would to a certain extent. And what we hope is that that if the consent is granted and the plant goes ahead, that is done. But we've still got to think about the people that have to cross the road to get to the footpath and get to the bus stop. We have quite a number of children that go to local high schools and primary schools that need to walk to the junction of Hallett Road and Johnson Road. And so we need to consider that, and I don't know if a footpath is going to totally mitigate that. I did list a whole lot of consent criteria that I won't go through all those, but for us personally, the container thing on our boundary is the biggest issue, and I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that that container terminal or container port or whatever you call it is totally enclosed and inside the building. A shelter belt is not going to cut it as far as we're concerned, and I think that's a reasonable request. And the other thing that I did allude to is that I enjoy looking at the stars at night, and I don't want to have a whole lot of floodlights destroying my view of the night sky. I just want to make mention of the fact that as a neighbour, we're probably seen as NIMBYs. We don't want this in our backyard. But I would be very happy for this to go ahead if I thought it had value. It would add value to our district, and I'm not sure if you're aware, but I'm a district councillor as well. And when we sign up for that, we take an oath to represent the whole district. And my view is that it's not of great enough economic benefit to outweigh the cost to our community. And I also have some issues with the social licence. I don't think that this particular industry has a social licence to operate, and no one's asked us whether that we think that water bottling is good for our area. I just want to point out too that I just read something today about, I think it's a water bottling company in France called Vidal. It is in trouble at the moment because the aquifers run out. And I did note in their article that they produce 600,000 bottles per hour, and it employs 18 people. The proposal in front of us is 170,000 bottles per hour, and I'm not sure if they're overstating the number of employees they're going to have, but it seems like an outrageous extrapolation. And my last point really is about the water bottles and the pollution. A quick play with numbers on the calculator: 4.5 billion bottles per year. 10% of those bottles are being recycled in China. Where do the other 4 billion bottles go? And it's probably outside the remit of your authority, but I think that we should have some conscience over of the industries that we permit to go ahead in our country. Is it okay for China to bear the brunt of all that pollution? If it was happening in New Zealand, would we be allowing it? So that's the sort of the summary from me today.
Great, thank you very much. Questions?
Yeah, I have perhaps a general question. This is one I've been asking all the residents who've submitted to us. What you believe is the rural character or the rural lifestyle character of the area you live in, and that's helpful to us. We've had one site visit and gone up the road and had a look around and then come back, but that's just a snapshot in time. So you've been there for a little while. I don't know if you said how long you've resided there for?
18 months.
18 months. But if you could describe what you believe is the rural character of that area, that would be helpful.
Well, when we went to look at that area, it's on a quiet country road, and it's not on a main road. And I think this is, you alluded to this, that, in rural areas you do get lots of trucks. You get tractors, you get people making hay, you get the horticulture, the bird scarers, the booms and what have you. You get used to that sort of stuff. But I don't think that the scale of this plant fits with what we bought into. We bought into a little quiet road where my wife rides horses, my kids ride bikes, we walk on that road. That's what drew us to that area. And actually, one of the points I made in my written submission was that there seems to be the district council has gone down the path of allowing lifestyle block development in this area. And on one hand, so we are encouraging more people to move onto the plains and have a lifestyle there, but at the same time, the council is also allowing an industrial-sized operation to happen in our neighbourhood. And I don't think that's fair.
I've got it's quite a specific question. It's about the bus stop. I'm assuming the buses that come out are the school buses. And what's the size of the school bus?
There's numerous buses that stop there because there's different schools.
Oh, okay.
There's some that go to primary school and some that go to Edgecombe College, Kawerau College as well.
Whereabouts are they turning?
They don't turn, they come past
Doing the loop.
and they park right across the road to let the students on. Imagine
Yep.
a T-junction, and they kind of pull on over the side and restrict the access for other vehicles.
All right.
So that definitely needs, obviously that needs a lot of work to be fixed.
Thank you. That's all my questions.
In terms of the containers, you've stressed your concern about the containers, and I can understand that given the location of your property. Is the concern with the containers the visual impact or the noise?
I'm not. I presume that we won't be seeing the containers, but the noise.
It's the noise.
And it probably won't be. I didn't have a look at all the report on the noise. We don't have access to a consultant to do that. But I presume that we won't see the containers, but the noise will obviously be at a level that's low, but it will be continuous. And I think that's the issue. Imagine us relaxing in the weekend and having this thing operating all the time, all day and all night. It is a concern.
Yeah.
And I think if we wanted to resell our property, we would have trouble reselling as a result of it.
So in terms of that, is the main concern, you mentioned the weekends just now, is that the focus of your concern?
Well, I think
Weekend activities?
one of the conditions that I put down was that if if it was to go ahead, that they should be in normal working hours and no weekend work and not after 5 o'clock in the evening.
So the weekend activity is a particular concern. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And the last submitter scheduled before a morning tea break, Reuben Cohen. Good morning and welcome.
Thank you.
Not sure how long you've been in the audience, but we've read your submission. Thanks very much for putting that in, and now you're very welcome to highlight your concerns to us.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope I come across clearly on this. I'm not used to microphones.
You're very clear
Okay,
at the
but
moment.
do tell me if I need to be clearer.
Okay.
Okay, my name is Reuben Cohen, and I'm an individual submitter, and I'm against the application put forward by Longford. I understand that talking about water abstraction is a bit useless over here because national laws allow this to happen, so no point discussing that. But the effect that this could have, certainly a lot of point in discussing that. I'm going to need to read a few bits and pieces that I had to copy from other papers, but essentially I'll just talk to it myself. Being an individual submitter, I don't get paid to do this. You know, Longfu and the councils get paid and can put a lot of time into it, but I come prepared as best I can. What concerns me is the absence of climate change. I don't understand why that has been left out, except in a token manner in this application, and also why it's been left out by the councils. To me, climate change should be renamed climate catastrophe because that's what it'll be for us. And we know that while the planet will survive, temperatures rising, etc., and all the attendant things that will come with it, we are not likely to. The Earth is said to be in a very fragile Goldilocks zone. In other words, you know, the temperature is not too hot and it's not too cold and it's just right. Well, that's changing. The Earth will still be in that same orbit, but actually the conditions for us won't be. To make the point a little bit more clearly and to say why I'm so concerned about it, in Alaska in February this year, now we're talking about Northern Hemisphere deep winter, they got temperatures 25 degrees Celsius higher than expected. That's in their midwinter. If you were to take that across to New Zealand and look at our midwinter and say, okay, on a nice winter day, we'd have 10 degrees, well, then you'd have to call that 35 Celsius in midwinter. This is happening, it hasn't happened here, it's happened in Alaska. What's happened also, and this is where it becomes a problem for us, permafrost over there is melting. It's releasing more and more of greenhouse gases, completely out of our control. Let's get closer to home. We've got the Antarctic. We've thought that it was melting at a certain rate. We're wrong. It's actually melting at a much higher rate because satellites couldn't show us the fact that underneath the ice surface, the part that was on the water itself had already melted. So we had to go there and sort of look at it personally before we could actually see that. And then, of course, change the scenario. It's very real, it's happening now. Why isn't it being addressed? Why is it that rules and regulations are not there in place? Notice for climate change was officially available from the New Zealand government in a white paper in 2002. That's 16 years ago. What's the excuse there? There have been numerous international meetings on climate change, which predated all that as well. It was well publicized. What's the excuse there? The RMA in Section 5, which I'll have to read to you now,
You don't need
and
to
you
read
know this,
Section
but
5. Yeah,
I'm
we know
bringing
it.
it up again. The RMA in Section 5 sets out the purpose of the Act. What's the purpose of the Act? In Part B, it says, safeguarding the life-supporting capacity of air, water, soil, and ecosystems. Safeguarding them, right? Not letting them get worse, actually helping. Part C, it says, avoiding remedying or mitigating any adverse effects of the activities on the environment. I'm going to have to put my glasses on. So we've got to do something about it. It says that's the purpose. That is the purpose of the Act. I don't see that being done. Nongfu says in its company overview conclusion, again, I'll have to quote what they've said, it's in the conclusion section, Creswell is committed to delivering a project that reflects the key principles of environmental sustainability. Well, okay, that's good, but we need to see it being sustained so that we can stay alive. And it may not be us, but the generation next and the generation next after that. NIWA, on climate change, in their paper, Section 5.1, Global Perspective, it says, the reduction of a 24-hour, 100-year storm event down to a 40-year storm event will have significant impacts. In other words, what they're saying over there is it's going to be 2.5 times worse because we're going to have to bring down this 100-year event to a 40-year event. It's going to happen every 40 years on average, but it'll probably happen more than that. And so they're sounding a warning as well. And the IPCC, which is the International Panel for Climate Change, has noted that adaptation will be necessary to address impacts resulting from the warming, which is already unavoidable due to past emissions, and that a portfolio of adaptation and mitigation is required to reduce the risk of climate change. Where is it? That's what I'd like to know. And IPCC continues, greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere are likely to increase for several decades yet. Disaster management and risk prevention strategies should adopt a cautionary framework. Cautionary framework, eh? Let's get to it. Let's do something about it. So we have over here New Zealand authorities, world authorities saying, pay attention to climate change now. In another document, Preparing for Climate Change, a guide for local government. This is a guide for local government from the national government, preparing for climate change. The question is asked, does the regional policy statement promote avoidance or limitation of dangers and costs from natural hazards, including those exacerbated by climate change, such as sea level rise, increasing rainfall intensity, increasing incidence of severity of drought, wind events, etc., etc. We all know about wind events. One of our councils, can't be sure which one, there's a lot of reading to have been done, in papers submitted for this hearing, section 15, says other matters, subsection 15.1, and it's entitled, any other matter that is relevant and reasonably necessary may be considered in making a decision. Well, their response to that was, there are no other matters relevant to consider. Oh, really? What complete nonsense is that? There are 3 areas which need urgent consideration for this particular application. The CO2, which will be produced from this application, it's a greenhouse gas, and it'll affect the temperature, and it'll just keep pushing it up. The manufacture of plastic, that's another thing that's coming out of this. And the adequate protection of our resources, that's the third, all related to climate change. In the first one, CO2 and greenhouse gases will be caused by transport, will be caused by burning of fossil fuels, will be caused by removal of trees. Now, the trees are going to be removed. There's going to be new trees planted over there. Do we know that this will be adequate? Nothing's been said about that. It's just a question of, let's get this site ready. Let's do what we need to do. Let's not think about the effect that it's going to have. The transport will be absolutely enormous. The amount of CO2 that will be produced on behalf of Nongfu, amazing. 180 trucks, 185 trucks, 190 trucks, who knows how many trucks it's going to be, plus another 120 vehicles daily. The trucks will be carrying shipping containers. They'll be big. They'll travel hundreds of kilometers. I'm assuming they're going to go from Otakiri down to Tauranga for the ports over there. I don't know where it'll be, but it's going to be a lot of mileage, and a lot of mileage is going to produce a huge amount of CO2. The best estimates that I can get, and I can't get some very good estimates on this, is that it's going to be at least 1/4 of a ton per truck per journey, one way. So you can figure that out for yourself as to how much that'll be in, and that's a conservative estimate. I didn't take the higher figures on that particular one, and I'm not offering them here as any proof. Find that out for yourselves if you would like to. Well, you know what Nongfu should do, because here's the trucking company going to produce all these greenhouse gases on behalf of Nongfu.
Mr. Cohen, I'm just going to interrupt you there. I'm not sure if you're aware, but under Section 70, capital A of the Resource Management Act.
A little bit louder, please, I'm sorry.
Not sure if you're aware, but under Section 70, capital A of the Resource Management Act, we can't have regard to any effects of discharges to air on climate change. Central government's reserved to itself the dealing with that issue. We as commissioners can't deal with that issue.
Yes, but there's also things that say that you can bring in stuff that you think is relevant. Now, because the paperwork hasn't kept up with the actual events that are happening over here, I'm trying to encourage you to bring in stuff that you need to.
I'm simply informing you that the issue you're bringing to our attention is outside our jurisdiction.
Well, I'm also saying to you that you can sit back and you can say, we can't do anything about it because we're not allowed to do anything about it, but that isn't going to stop it from happening. And I think you've got to take a realistic point of view, and the realistic point of view is, it is happening. I'd like to be able to finish this presentation, if I may.
Of course you can finish your presentation. I just wanted to make sure, if you weren't aware of that provision in the Act, that you are aware of it now.
I am aware of it now. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Well, there's going to be a lot of greenhouse gases produced and other pollutants which will come from the petrol and the diesel itself. Nothing's been done about that. I'm sure that you can take into account those pollutants as well, but nothing's been said about it. I don't like the idea that businesses can pass on problems to communities. I don't think that the profits should go towards the private sector, and then the social sector has got to pick up, including health effects that can be caused from these things. My feeling is that Nongfu might like to start its own trucking division, might like to maybe do something really ethical over there and put in electric trucks, get a good renewable resource to charge these things and then run them themselves. They're a big enough company. They're putting 50 million into this particular project. Good. They've got the money to do it. Well, they should do it. They also want to continue the permission to burn coal. Now, this is presumably to produce power for themselves.
Sorry,
They've got that.
I'm going to interrupt again. What are you referring to, burning coal?
This is producing power for themselves.
I'm just going to clarify with the applicant, I'm not aware of the proposal including any coal burning furnaces or
No,
anything.
Well, that's what it said in the application, in the original application, that they have the ability to burn coal, to burn wood waste, and to burn, I'm not sure what the other thing was, but there were three things that they could burn at their site at present, and they wanted this to just continue.
My understanding is there's no proposal for coal burning electricity
Okay.
generation.
Okay, well, fair enough.
Getting
I'll go
lost.
back
There is
and
none.
look it up. But what I'm saying is that you cannot allow things like that to happen today, whether you're talking about it being for climate change or not. Because you've also got particulates that come out of these things, and they are not acceptable. I'm not going to talk about the next section over there. I don't think that you will find that terribly relevant. The manufacture of plastics. Now, manufacture of plastics, which I presume you can take into effect, calculates that they'll be able to produce 43 one-litre plastic bottles every second.
Perhaps I might share in responding to Mr. Cohen. We don't have a proposal in front of us for the manufacture of plastics. As we understand it, there'll be plastic bottles delivered to the site, and they'll be used as vessels for the water which is taken from the ground. So we're primarily concerned with the take and use of the water that will be put into bottles. And then, of course, there are effects that we're looking at through the number of consents. So there's no proposal in front of us to manufacture bottles, and we'll perhaps get the applicant to clarify that.
Forms delivered which are blow moulded, so using
Yes, that's
steam and shaped.
Yes, that's right.
So that's the only manufacture as such, but no creation of plastic, that's correct.
Could you clarify that for me, please?
Perhaps if we could get the applicant to clarify that matter.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. So I have a fairly rudimentary understanding, so I can get more information for you, Mr. Cohen, if that would be useful afterwards.
Yeah.
But I understand it's a unit of plastic in a solid form,
Yes.
delivered to the site,
Yes.
and then heated using steam
Yes.
and created into a bottle shape
Yes.
before the filling.
That's what I refer to as manufacturing it. Okay, it might come in that little form, but you're going to actually make the bottles on site. Right. And that, to me, is creating the form that itself is manufacturing those bottles. Now, all those bottles, or most of those bottles, I'm assuming, is going to go overseas. We're going to be a plastics manufacturer in this country. It'll go overseas, it'll cause pollution overseas, and it'll have on it water from New Zealand. And so already I'm sure there are other people who are extracting water, who are sending this water overseas in plastic containers, causing all this problem. Now we know that plastic bottles end up with problems. As far as I can make out, the best recycling of PET plastic bottles comes to about 30%. But on average, it's actually down to 11%. Again, I don't see that this is very ethical, that we're going to create more and more problems for the profit that's going to come from it, and we don't have to think about the rest of it. I know that Nong Fu has said, yes, it'll sit down and it'll work out policy, and it's very happy to do that, but that's not good enough. What you need is to actually take that plastic back, or take back a known quantity of that plastic from other sources, so that whatever you produce, you then work on yourself. You don't leave it for others to do. We've got enough plastic in the Pacific Ocean. It's coming our way. We'd be silly to think that it's not. We've got plastic microfibers have been found in all sorts of products. It's been found in honey, been found in sugar, shellfish, bottled water, tap water, beer, processed food, table salt, soft drinks, I don't need to go on, you can see it's in everything. It's not enough to return plastic bottles. What you've got to do is stop making them. We need to do that at the point of manufacture. Just stop doing it. Nongfu should be able to show that there's no danger from plastic waste, especially those nano-sized particles, before they make any more plastic. This plastic is so much part of our lives and our bodies that there are no people and no places on earth where you will not find plastic. This has a profound effect on determining its safety. There can be no control groups, that is, groups without plastic, that you can compare it to see what the effects are. There's that much of it about, and there's that much that has gone into absolutely everything. You go and eat some fish, and you find that it's in the fish's flesh. It's not just it's strangling creatures, etc., like that, but it's actually got into every single thing. So that leads me on to the adequate protection of the resources. Policy 16.8.3 Part A, to protect groundwater recharge zones from contamination. Are these recharge zones for the aquifer that we're having here, are they being monitored, the recharge zones? Do the councils even know for sure where the recharge zones are? The aquifer in this application is thought to be fed from Lake Tarawera, wherever that's thought to be fed. It's an assumption. If Lake Tarawera is a recharge zone, is it being protected? Are people chucking plastic bottles in there and that plastic going to make its way into the aquifer? You know, the councils have been in existence for long enough now to have been able to trace the recharge zones for this aquifer. Should they become contaminated, will the community, or will Nongfu be able to sue the councils having not protected the recharge zone? It's hard to comprehend that climate change mitigation of a serious nature has been glossed over and probably completely ignored as well. I don't see why that has happened. And I understand what you pointed out about you're not allowed to take it into account. I can't even understand that bit. To me, it seems that the regulators have failed to do their job, and the applicant seems to be less ethical than they say that they are. This application should have been rejected when it was first seen. There are businesses around the world that have taken into consideration climate change and are now doing quite well. There's a clothing manufacturer called Patagonia. It's a US manufacturer of outdoor clothing. The company will first try to repair clothing that is brought to it. They repaired 40,000 garments last year. And then if repair is not possible, they'll offer the customer a refurbished alternative. And then if that's not suitable, then they'll sell new to the customer. In fact, they took out adverts saying to their customers, why is it that you want something that's new? Why can't it just be recycled? Why can't it just be repaired? And they made last year $800 million US. They grow without wanting to grow. They employ more people than similar garment manufacturers because of the repair and refurbishment of their garments. Plenty of jobs, and the companies existed for a very long time. They've had problems and they've sorted them. And people seem to appreciate that they're actually running themselves on the basis of, we don't want to cause any more trouble. What Nongfu's doing in this particular case is old-fashioned. It's the old-style stuff. We don't have to think about the environment. We just go ahead and make the profits out of it. It's too destructive. It's based on profit, constant growth, which is impossible, and spin. If a business had debt problems, it negotiated with a bank. If it had pollution problems, it went to the regulatory authorities. If it had a supply problem, it went to their suppliers and negotiated. Now, what are you going to do? Negotiate with the climate. It's inappropriate. and
Khan, I'm just
useless
going to
and
interrupt.
extreme.
Just want to inquire from you how much longer you anticipate your presentation taking.
Yeah, I know you're fed up with it, but I'm just finishing.
No, I'm just simply asking you how long you think you'll take, because we're coming up to
Just
our
finished.
scheduled morning tea time, so,
I'm just finishing.
okay.
Thank you. I find that they need to actually change. When you look at jobs being offered and you look at climate change and you say, what's more important? You know, recently up in Auckland, there was all this wind and stuff that went down there. And my son who lives up there, trees fell down on either side of his street, couldn't get to a job. Job didn't matter. Electricity gone, right? Eating cold food, staying in a cold house, what was the job going to do? Same thing happened to me. Edgecombe, flooded out. House gone, taken over by the council. The property gone. 30 years of living over there gone. So now what they're going to do is they're going to build a better, a new stop bank to stop that happening again. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. Why? Because they're going to give consents that are going to make it worse. And we're not allowed to talk about it? That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. See if we have any questions for you.
I didn't have any questions.
And I have no further questions either. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you
Cohen.
for listening.
We now adjourn for morning tea and we'll reconvene at 10:40 where we hear from Chris Sides. Mr. Sides here? Yep,
Excellent.
you're on after morning tea. So we'll reconvene at 10:40. Thank you.